The projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 21, Comedy to the Max, in which Jim Reid rejoins me after a brief hiatus to talk with our guest about one of the pioneers of film comedy. Of whom do I speak?
The man we call Max.
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 Push the button, Max.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. Charlie Chaplin has become synonymous with silent film comedy in the minds of most people with any sense of film history. Those with a somewhat broader knowledge will also know Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. There are other names they'll probably be familiar with, but you'll have to go fairly far down the list before getting to the name Max Linder in terms of people's familiarity. Nevertheless, if not for Max Linder, there might not be a Charlie Chaplin as we've come to know him. Here to enlighten us is the author of the book The Rise and Fall of Max Linder, Lisa Stein Haven. Jim, it's good to have you back in the co-pilot seat. And Lisa, welcome to Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thank you.
Now, before we dive into the life and career of Max Linder, and I hope I don't sound like a game show host here, but please tell us a bit about your background and the books you've written.
Well, I'm a professor of English at Ohio University, but really my research area is silent film comedy. My first book was on Sid Chaplin, who is Charlie's brother. And since then, I've written a couple of books on Charlie and this one on Max Linder. And I am currently finishing one on Buster Keaton. So,
Professor of English, I am so in trouble. I'll just say this, the subject at hand being a French artist, and a lot of French titles come up, of course, in the discussion of him. There is a very high probability that somewhere along the line, I'm going to mispronounce something. Anyhow, so I'm curious, as a professor of English, how did you come to discover and develop an affinity for silent comedy?
Well, that actually started back when I was in middle school, age of 13, 14. Luckily for me, our lunchtime was divided in two parts. The first half hour was eating, and the second half hour was watching old films. I don't know if you remember back in those days, but all of the old silents were coming back to the fore. People were discovering them. They were appearing on television, things like that. So that's really where it all started for me.
Okay. I might remember back then, but my school wasn't as enlightened. So I had to discover them in a more roundabout way. What was your first exposure to Max Linder?
Actually, Max Linder, I only saw in Kevin Brownlow's wonderful Unknown Chaplin series. I think he has a little snippet in there. I believe it's in the second film called My Happiest Years, which talks a little bit about Max and his career for like under 3 minutes. So that's probably where I first saw him.
Okay. Well, I was fascinated reading your book. And again, the title is The Rise and Fall of Max Linder. And something that struck me as him being a pioneer in a way that I'd never read of anyone else doing. And that was he began doing stage acting, as a number of them did, some sort of stage work. And then when he first got into films, it was in this kind of hybrid manner, utilizing films with stage productions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Actually, it was stage first, and then he got bit parts in films and then became more famous. And then he went on tour, and that's where the hybrid performances came in. And basically what they consisted of, he would go to whatever location. These were all on the tour. Like, he went to Moscow, and he went to various places in Italy and Portugal and all those places. So he would go to the city one day early with a cameraman and film a little chase scene where he's being chased through the city streets of that particular city. And that would become the intro of the stage performance. So the night of the performance, everybody's in there waiting for what's going to happen. And the first thing they see is this film. No, I'm sorry. The first thing they see is Or here is some audio of Max suggesting that he's been delayed. He's not going to make it. And then he's running through the streets trying to get there, right? So that's a film. And then the next part is him arriving on stage, and he might do that in some bombastic way, like climbing down a rope or bursting out of something. I don't know. And then the rest of the performance would be a combination of vaudeville or music hall type acts. He would do some dancing with the leading lady or something, and then he would show snippets of the film that he was currently trying to advertise, whatever that might be, or he would show the whole film. So really a very, very unique way of getting his name out there. And I think it really made all the difference in regards to his incredible popularity, which was as good as Chaplin, if not superseded Chaplin before Chaplin was Chaplin,
Right.
So yeah, a very unique thing to do. And unfortunately, none of the films that he made as intros survive that we know of. It would be great to find one of those and see what it was like.
What year did he switch to just film?
1905, I think.
Okay.
He might have done a couple of stage things after that, but they were mainly for like charity events and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, no, it struck me, and I could be cute and give myself just a major editing project here and correct this, but what I neglected to ask leading into this, what should have preceded that question is, can you give us just a little mini biography of his beginnings as a performer, actor, coming to the stage and then to film?
Yes, well, he was born into a wealthy family, wealthy-ish family in the Bordeaux region. They were vintners, so they were wine growers and sellers and things like that. That's why he changed his name. His name was Olivier, which is impossible to say for us in America, and to Linder, which he saw on a sign someplace, and his sister suggested or something like that. So he was kind of the odd kid in that he didn't want to follow in his parents' footsteps or his brother's footsteps or anything. He wanted to be creative. And so they did relent and sent him to acting school, first in Bordeaux, and then he ended up in Paris, of course, because that's where you want to be, right? But the first couple of years, Comédie Française rejected him in their sort of apprenticeship program. He was rejected twice. And he did kind of have a sort of an up and down stage career in that sometimes he would get fairly decent reviews, but it was never like an overwhelmingly positive review. So obviously the stage was not where he was supposed to be, yet he had to kind of go through that sort of tutelage to become the performer that he was. He didn't have music hall. He didn't have vaudeville to kind of train him or anything. That's why we have the nice cinema theater events, which work in that way a little bit. But then somebody suggested to him that he try Pathé. They were hiring for small parts here and there. He decided to do that to kind of supplement his meager earnings. And within a couple of years, he was given a contract. So that started in 1905 was his first film. So you can see that's a good 9 years before Chaplin started.
Yeah. Yeah. He definitely got out of the gate early there. And I gather now I don't have much exposure. Well, nobody does, I guess, really, because of the few films that survive from that era. But for instance, John Bunny or Burt Williams, the films that they were doing, I'm wondering, was Max Linder the first one to really establish a consistent character that people would identify from one film to the next?
Do you know what the dates are for John Bunny? Because I think he was right around the same time.
Jim, do Jim?
No, I don't.
I'd like to say Max is first, but he didn't really develop that character until a film called Le Pendu, which means the hangman. So it was in that particular film that he kind of came up with this dandy, pseudo riche young man who was really kind of daffy as well.
Is that the one that was based on a poem?
Yes, that's sheet music. Yeah, a popular piece of music at the time. Oh,
song. Okay. Yeah,
but his character in the film was kind of the dandyish young man who was not all that bright. So that's basically what his character became.
And in contrast to Chaplin, who of course then developed The Tramp.
Right.
Now, another thing that was interesting is that aside from the hybrid shows that we talked about that he did utilizing film for his entrances and so forth, he seems unique in that once he started making films, he didn't just throw himself completely into them. He continued to do both for a period of time, which Keaton didn't do, Chaplin didn't do.
I think it had to do with France and the sort of pecking order for actors. Nobody knew what film was or what it was going to be. And so why throw your whole fortune into that? You need to kind of stay on the stage and make sure that your name is out there, because you don't know if that Pathé Film Studios is going to go under or not, initially. So I think that had more to do with it than anything else. But it also gave him a great affinity for audiences. I think I talk about that a little bit, that one of his great successes was his relationship with audiences. And that has to be on the stage, of course. So
yeah.
By the way, just because I'm really good at timing, it's 1909 for John Bunny.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. And actually, see, I put myself a chronology here comparing some of these guys.
Le Pendu, I believe, is 1906. So he would have predated him a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. So his personality in the films, of course, largely tied into his character, very broad, outgoing, daring, that sort of thing. But it seems as though that really was kind of his personality based on some of the incidents that you relate in your book. I think of the flood at the Pathé stages. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about that?
That occurred, let's see, was it 1911? I'm not sure about the date, but anyway, the Seine overflows, or it did back then. Actually, it just did a couple years ago. I don't know if you saw the pictures or not, but back in those days, it was a big deal because a lot of places would get flooded out. So this particular year, Pathé became underwater. And the story goes that Max was one of the people on the front lines trying to bail it out. Now, that could have simply been a story that he cooked up with a reporter, to try to make himself feel or sound good or something. It seems odd that of all the actors and all the directors and all the personnel they had at Pathé, that he was the only one that was named. You know what I mean? But at the same time, of course, that's the sort of character he wanted to present to everybody. I think in reality, he was quite a bit more irascible than that. He talks at one point about his affinity for Charlie Chaplin, that they both had the same sort of dark soul in a way. He's a very much, in some sense, an introvert and thinks too much and things like that. So he certainly doesn't want to present that as his character to the film-going audience.
So you mentioned him being in the front lines of the flood as the story went, but apparently he didn't quite make it to the front lines in World War I when he served in the army, although I gather he did ultimately acquit himself rather well, but was, I guess, his biggest enemy during that time, it sounds like, were health issues.
Yes, he had a appendicitis a couple of years before that, I believe 1911. And that really sapped his health throughout the rest of his life. So if you think about how barbaric and prehistoric surgery was back in those days, and this one was a botched one to boot. So that, and plus his little touch of tuberculosis that he had that would kick up now and then, were a couple of things that kept him from serving. All he did was drive generals around and stuff, drive officers around. But still, they thought of him as very honorable for just that amount. And he only did that for a couple months. I have a great story in the book about one particular person who was the father of one of his best friends that he drove around behind the front lines one night. And he wasn't supposed to put his headlights on. He put his headlights on. He didn't know the passwords. And it's a really quite a funny story. And it's amazing that they ever made it to where they were going. So,
yeah.
I got your book as soon as it came out.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, I really didn't know much about Linder. And I don't know why, but just I'd seen one or two of the films, but really wasn't into it that much. But this last week, I've been, doing my homework, and I was just amazed how good they are, and
they are good.
Yeah, and what a dramatic life the guy had.
Yes, very much.
Yeah.
That's what attracted me to him to do a book, actually. So.
Well, that was something that's been needed.
Yeah,
because that's a whole. Yeah.
There's a gap.
Yeah.
One thing that I noticed in your book is it seems like he made films at pretty much every opportunity. For instance, when he would be touring, he didn't just go there and put on a show. He would incorporate either shooting those films to work into a stage act, or he would make an entire film when he was somewhere on location. And so that I found pretty interesting.
Yes. When he was in Berlin, for instance, he shot The Professor of Tango, which has some scenes at the beginning of the Brandenburg Gate, for instance, and other things that you can easily identify as being from Berlin. When he was in Moscow, he made 3 films, which are lost, but I'm sure they're in the Gosfo film archive somewhere over there. Nobody's just noticed them, but yes, he made 3 films over there. And let's see, there's also the one in the Spanish bullfight ring that he did on location as well. So you're right. He's very opportunistic in terms of shooting films wherever he had the chance to shoot them. So he must have been traveling with some technical people because he wasn't shooting the films himself, obviously. So
right. I recall from the book also something very interesting is the accompanist that he had when he was performing in Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Dmitry Triumkin, I think is his name. Yeah. He did a lot of scores for a bunch of American films in the 40s and 50s, I believe.
Lost Horizon.
Yeah.
Well, and High Noon, I think, one of his most famous there. Yeah. Yeah, one of the big ones. And you alluded to the bullfighting, which reminds me that another aspect of his personality and his career was that he seemed to be fairly fearless in terms of executing stunts.
Yeah.
Whether it was how he was arriving at one of his shows or working with animals.
That's true. Until he had a couple of accidents on tour and decided to start using a double. So one of those was being goaded by a bunch of undergraduates into jumping off the stage. He jumped off the stage, but he missed their box and fell to the floor and ended up quite injured from that. I think that pretty much from that point on, he started using doubles, especially in his cinema theater events. But he did a lot with animals that seemed to be pretty scary, and he wasn't using doubles there that I know of with the lions in 7 Years Bad Luck and everything. And the lions, I know for sure in the circus, the last one, he actually learned how to be a ringmaster for lions with the whip and everything. So he was actually doing that. I don't know if you've seen that one's pretty hard to find, but
yeah, I was not able to find that one, so I have not had an opportunity to see it. But
there was also a jump in the Three Musketeers that was from extremely high.
Yes. And, I wonder if he used a double for that one, Jim.
I would guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I would think so, because he wasn't in good health any time he was in America.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I assumed when I saw it. But for me, I thought maybe the most hazardous thing he did in that one was when he was practicing his fencing against the tail of the mule. And I'm thinking, you're getting a little close there,
Yeah.
End up with a hoof sandwich here in a second.
Well, unless he practiced that so much that the mule was used to it or something, perhaps. I don't know.
Lost a great uncle that way.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, there are a number of films. Actually, before we get into some specific ones, just generally, how would you describe, if it's even fair to use the word typical Max Linder film?
A typical Max Linder film would be starting out with, showing Max's very luxurious apartment. And then you realize that he may be wealthy and have a lot of money, but he is totally inept in regards to women. So he meets up with some woman who wants something of him that he doesn't have. Like, let's see, the one I was thinking of was, I think there was one about the bullfighting, actually, where she's saying, if you only could bullfight, then I would marry you or something. So it's always some sort of
how many of us have heard that?
Yeah. It might be boxing. It's something that he doesn't have the skill to do. And so he comes up with all these cockamamie ways of getting this skill. He never gets it. I think one of them is, I think he practices the bullfighting on a cow in his apartment. I mean, how do you get a cow in your apartment? And his butler is acting as, his assistant or whatever. He never really gets it. So at the end, he has to lie about it in some way. He's hiding behind a curtain and demonstrating a skill that he doesn't have. They all go differently, but that's pretty much it. It's like Max is wealthy. He has a lot to offer seemingly, but he's not real bright and he doesn't have a lot of talents. He doesn't have a lot of skills that would attract the opposite sex. He tries. in every way possible. He spends as much money as he has to spend to try to win these women. Sometimes he gets them in the end, but not always. They usually go to some more attractive suitor of some sort.
Well, there was one that stands out in my mind, and a lot of them are available to see on YouTube.
Yes,
either English prints or the original French versions. Right. I guess I even saw one that was a Russian print. Obviously,
the Russians love him.
But the one that stands out in my mind doesn't really fit the formula that you just described, but it really made an impression on me. And I'm not sure, I couldn't tell you what the French title is. Basically, it translates as Max's New Hat. And it's pretty basic slapstick stuff. He gets himself a new hat and going to see his girl, and something happens to the hat. And so he has to go back and get another one. And then something else happens. He finally gets to the house, and I'm not going to spoil it. I'm just going to say the final gag in it is one that really surprised me for that era. I had a couple of thoughts of how it might go, but I'll just say it involves a dog. A couple of ways I thought it might go, but then was surprised at how it actually went in a film of that vintage. So,
but you can see that he's trying to impress a girl with the hat, right?
That's true.
And it doesn't work out. So.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, for sure. But then we talked about the fact that he took opportunities to make films wherever he went. And he also, and I guess by this time he was famous enough, he could do this, incorporated parts of his own life into his filmmaking, because in 1911, he does a film title, basically Max's Convalescence, I think is put it simply. And he builds a film around his recovery from surgery.
That's right. And it's based at the family home, which I have very fortunately been able to see in person. So it's at the family home in Bordeaux. His sister's in it, his mother, his father, his dog, and his horse. So basically he got someone to come out and film him while he was recovering from the surgery. Yeah.
So essentially a home movie.
It's a home movie, but the conflict is involved between himself and his horse, who is named Kiss.
Okay. Well, then we go along, and in terms of paralleling this, I was making myself a kind of a comparative timeline here. So at the time of the film we just talked about, Max en Convalescence apparently is the French title. And that's 1911. Chaplin wasn't on the horizon yet. Keaton wasn't. Harold Lloyd wasn't.
No.
And then in
Max Sennett wasn't. Max Sennett wasn't even doing anything yet, I don't think. Was he, Jim?
Okay.
He was just doing dramas for Biograph.
Right. That's what I thought.
Yeah. Okay. And then in 1917, he decides to try his hand in America. And there is actually a film of him coming to America called Max Comes Across. Now, I have not been able to find that one. Does that one exist?
It does not. Parts of it exist. Last year at Pordenone, they thought they had the whole thing, and it turned out to be something else. I think it turned out to be Max in a Taxi. So it's probably out there someplace, but it hasn't really been found. It's probably in an archive someplace, I would think. But it hasn't really been found so that we can all see it. It's not a documentary, but it is based on some things that happened to him on the ship that he came over on, including being bombed or something by a German boat. Actually, it wasn't his ship. It was a ship near his that happened to. And it really was not something at the time that people would find funny. It's like, has it been long enough that I can make a joke about this? No.
Yeah.
Not really. Bombing ships, people are still worried about it. So don't make a joke about it right now.
If I recall correctly, this is where he got the idea for the mirror gag.
No, that was several years later. Actually, 1913 was the first time he used the mirror gag. That was in a film called Max and the Duel.
Okay.
Or Max Has a Duel, is I think is the name of it. That was in 1913. He got sued by the Schwartz brothers, who felt that they owned that gag. And now, if your listeners don't know the gag or don't remember, you might have seen Lucille Ball and Harpo do it. You might have seen the Marx Brothers do it in Night at the Opera?
Duck Soup.
I'm sorry.
And Chaplin used it, or a variation of it, in his first Mutual film, The Floorwalker.
That's right. So it's basically a mirror gag between two people who are not the same. They're supposed to be the same.
Had that developed on stage, or was that a film?
That developed on
creation?
stage by the Schwartz brothers, who
Okay.
claimed copyright of it, and they sued Max for the 1913 film, and then by the time he got to 7 Years Bad Luck and did it again, it was the 37th suit that they had put against someone.
Wow. Well, everybody's got to have a hobby.
I like the twist they did at the end where they replaced it with a new mirror.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a little bit unexpected there. But I just remember the story, and I was thinking it was because he was on the ship and something happened. But it's in your book there where something happens in the middle of the night that disturbs him. He opens the door in the dimly lighted corridor and sees someone looks just like him, is just as frightened, and then realizes it's a mirror. So apparently,
That's
I guess
true.
that was his explanation for it. I guess maybe trying to explain it away from the suit.
Maybe it was different enough because it didn't involve two actors. So the actual act itself has to have two actors, and that was just himself looking in a mirror.
Yeah. So then Max comes across, that's 1917, and that's when he comes here to start making movies for, I believe it was SNA, wasn't it?
Right. And he only came because the First World War had decimated the film industry in France. So he couldn't make films there anymore. And he was at wit's end as to where he was going to make films, because certainly he wasn't old enough to consider retiring or anything.
Yeah. And Chaplin had just gone to Mutual. So apparently SNA was looking to replace him as their big star.
That's right.
And,
yes, absolutely.
Didn't quite work out that way, I guess.
No, for many reasons, but probably the main one was Max's health, which was bad.
How were the reviews? I mean, I know the films don't exist anymore, but
they do exist.
Oh, they do?
Exist. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think all of them are on disc, actually. I think Serge Bromberg did a disc.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, I've seen them all, except for Max Comes Across, which is kind of missing. But the second one is fantastic, which is Be My Wife. I adore that one. It's really, really funny. And the third one, Max in a Taxi, you can tell how sick he is in that one. And it's really kind of painful to watch, especially when he's doing these really dangerous tricks. There's something with him up on electrical wires, and there's sparks flying and all this stuff. And it's kind of difficult to watch that one. But
well, I watched it not being aware of his condition at that time. And I was actually impressed early on. I don't have the sense that it was a double just because it was too tight a shot, I think, for them to pull it off. But there's a scene early on when he and his drinking buddy are trying to commandeer a taxi, I guess it is, and he can't figure out, or no, actually, I take that back. I think maybe it's when he is going to be the driver. He's pretending to be the driver, but he has no idea how to get in the thing. And he goes this roundabout way, and it's a rather gymnastic manner in which he finally gets himself into the driver's seat. And I was kind of impressed by that.
Yeah, very much so. It's funny, and it also certainly underscores the fact that he's filthy rich and just dithering his life away, pretty much. So, that characterization.
As we said, around the time of, the beginning of his time at SNA, 1917, Max Comes Across and the other films, and then Chaplin's at Mutual. Keaton is supporting Arbuckle at this point, and Harold Lloyd is doing his Lonesome Luke series. So just as kind of a comparison of what was going on at that time.
Buster's just getting started.
Yeah.
March of 1917. So, yeah.
And then, we've been talking about 7 Years Bad Luck, and the most memorable thing from that tends to be the mirror scene. But that's not the only aspect of it that's impressive in terms of his performance or even the story. And parallel with that, Chaplin's doing The Kid. Keaton, by this time, and this is 1921, Keaton is doing his own films. That year, he does The Goat and The Playhouse. So they're really innovating. And you see some evolution, some progression by Max Linder from just the basic, simple slapstick stuff he was doing, which probably more reminiscent of Keystone than other films. Harold Lloyd's doing Never Weekend, and then dipping his toe into longer films, Sailor Made Man. Then after 7 Years Bad Luck, would you say that The Three Must Get Theirs is his pinnacle? I mean, in one manner or another, either creatively or box office?
I don't know how well it did in the box office, really, but for me, it's the pinnacle by far. But you have to kind of watch it after you watch the Fairbanks film that it's based on, because it is a point for point parody of
Three
that particular
Musketeers.
film. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you watch them together or one after the other, you're going to be even more impressed with how great it is. It's kind of like watching Chaplin's Carmen movie. I mean, you have to watch the original one first to realize just how brilliant his is, you know. But anyway, he used Fairbanks' sets. Doug let him use all the sets for his film. And there's the whole anachronism thing, which is really, I think, very innovative on his part. So you can actually try to identify anachronisms through the film and see what he's doing with those. And he's got some great actors. He's got Jabina Ralston, who is Harold Lloyd's main squeeze. And he's got Bull Montana and other folks in there. Some really, really great performances. Caroline Rankin, she's really good too.
Yeah, I thought the tone of it, I mean, I had seen the Fairbanks Three Musketeers, but it's been a while, so I wasn't able to make the scene by scene comparison. But just overall in tone and approach, including the anachronistic gags, what it really reminded me of was Keaton's Three Ages, which of course had not come out yet. But in fact, there's one gag in there. I have to wonder if it inspired Keaton. There's a scene in it where the mule has eaten his hat, and he's got to acquire a new one. And the scene where he's selecting a new one kind of foreshadows the one in Steamboat Bill Jr.
That's true. You're right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I have to wonder if that inspired him for that. So that's 1922. The three must get theirs. Meanwhile, Chaplin's over at First National doing The Pilgrim. Keaton's doing Cops and Electric House. Harold Lloyd's doing Grandma's Boy, Dr. Jack. And we talk about the three must get theirs being kind of the pinnacle. And then things, I guess, start to kind of fall apart for Max.
One of the things that happened was that Max threw a going away party for himself. He decided to leave. He left before the film premiered in America. He left in spring of 22, right after the film wrapped. But before he went, he had a party and invited the big three there, Doug, Mary, and Charlie. And he showed his new film. He showed The Three Musketeers. And they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And they wanted to sign him immediately to Allied Artists, which is the European arm of United Artists. And they did that. But Max was so upset by the fact that it had taken them this long to offer that to him. I think that was like the final slap in the face or something, you know. He went home. He never, ever used the Allied Artists contract. You know, he made a couple of films, but he did not release them through Allied Artists. So I think he was just so demoralized by the time he left America. He had spent some time in a sanatorium for his tuberculosis there. He was just ready to get home. And I think his mental problems started to escalate a little bit, because what's going to happen in the next 2 years, 3 years is just incredible. The decline is rapid and it's horrifying. So
yeah. Well, this is getting into the title of the book, The Rise and Fall of Max Linder. And I'm wondering, there's not really a mention that I recall anyway in the book talking about any kind of medications. There's certainly plenty of documentation about his injuries, his illnesses, that sort of thing. Do you think did he ever fight addiction of anything, or were there any medications that he might have been taking to deal with pain, or that really messed with him?
Well, that's something that's lost to history. There was some speculation about drug use, especially when things were going so badly with his wife and his treatment of her. But as we all know, you cannot diagnose someone from the past. First of all, we're not psychotherapists. Second of all, God knows what he had. I mean, if you were to kind of try to figure it out through the descriptions, I would say borderline syndrome, which is manic depression. That's the new term for it. But I can't do that really.
Sure.
So what we had was mental problems that escalated. We had unreal paranoia. The paranoia was just out there so extreme that no one could reason with him and talk to him. Plus, he had this sort of status in society at the point where things were going poorly that people just didn't want to deal with it. Forget Nanette. I mean, what is she? She's just a woman and a young woman to boot. So she didn't have any status in society. So they're not going to come to her aid, even after she had the baby. So unfortunately, that was just a function of the times and the place, I think. But certainly he had mental issues. There's no doubt about that to me. But what they were, how they manifested, I don't think he was taking anything to combat them. He spent a lot of time at sanatoriums over the years. They would go to Switzerland to spend time in the sanatoriums there. That was what they like to do for vacation. So I don't know. Yeah.
So as he's declining, he does do a couple of final films that I think are worth talking about. One of which is not a feature. It's short. Let me know if I pronounce this correctly, in which case, what do I win? Au secours. Would that be
secours,
correct?
Yeah.
Which translates
means help me.
Yeah. And
help.
Yeah. No, that didn't put the Beatles in my head at all. But that's an interesting one because storyline, it's basically pretty simple. It's a standard, can a guy stay in a haunted house for a period of time to, in this case, to win a wager? And a lot of bizarre things go on. And it actually, to me, seemed like kind of a throwback to Georges Méliès. Some of the things that he did,
right.
Minimal set and that sort of thing. But what fascinates me beyond that is that it was written and directed by Abel Gance.
Yes, they had a history, actually. I understand, and I have not been able to identify him in any of the early films, but he was in some of the early Max Linder films, Gance. And so they had some sort of a relationship all the way back to the early days, 8, 9, 10. So that's where that began. I don't know, as Abel got more and more successful, he did these great films like La Rue, for instance, which he had just completed, that Max, in his desperation, wanted to piggyback on top of that and try to call upon his old friend to help him out. I mean, that has to be why it was made, because Gance did nothing but try to get the thing distributed afterwards and had a heck of a time. There's just tons and tons of correspondence at the Cinémathèque Française archive about how much trouble he had trying to get the thing in America, for instance. Like when it got there, it didn't do very well anyway. So it was just a nightmare from the beginning to end. So it supposedly started on a wager between the two of them. We can make a film in 3 days. So the reality of it was, some people said it was actually created in 10 days, some in 3 weeks. So we don't know for sure how long it actually took, but from the looks of it, not long.
Yeah, it looked like there was some stock footage thrown in there too. And then, Gance would, of course, fade into history. Oh, no, he did Napoleon. That's right.
No, that's right.
That was his next film.
Thank God, he recouped his losses.
I got a question. Did his costume choice, the top hat and the evening wear, do you think that influenced Raymond Griffith?
Wasn't Raymond Griffith doing a vaudeville act already, like for many, many years? It seems like I've run into his name as I'm working on the Buster vaudeville years. I just wonder what his characterization was then. I don't have any information about whether he was influenced by
the
Max
films
or not,
I'm thinking of started around 23.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have a good answer for you, Jim. I'm
okay.
sorry. I thought of that too, though. I've thought about it.
Yeah.
One interesting thing too that's probably worth a mention is that you indicated in there that, now I don't know how realistic this ever was at any given point, but I guess he and Gance had talked about doing an adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac.
Yes. Yeah, they were thinking about it. I don't know how seriously, but that was what they were putting in the press. So, I mean, if you're making a stupid film like Au Secours, are you going to talk about that and kind of ruin it? It's one of those films where you want to make sure no one talks about it after, because otherwise it's going to be worthless. Or are you going to make up something about this very famous story that everybody knows, Cyrano de Bergerac? I think that happens a lot. That's what I think about that.
Okay.
More lies for the press.
Yeah. Well, it would have been interesting to see him try to fill a role that was something beyond just this unique character he'd created for his comedy. And that actually reminds me, even going back to earlier, 1909, he played Arsène Lupin.
And that one's lost. Bandit. I would have loved to have seen that one. I mean, that's actually a character that the French would have known very well. And it was a cat burglar type of character. Certainly not anything like Max's usual persona.
Yeah, and looking on IMDb, apparently there was only one prior film with the character. Yeah, I mean, it was a literary character to begin with, and then
Right.
started showing up in the movies. And the first one in 1908, so this one would have been right on the heels of that, and that certainly would be interesting to see if it wasn't lost. Speaking of which, how many films have been documented with Max Linder?
Well, Max always said he had 300 plus films. Now I didn't find any of them, but Catherine Corman, who did the filmography for the book,
which is amazing, by the way. I mean, it's almost a book in and of itself.
Yeah, it is really great.
Yeah. She's been working with Max's films and adding them to her lists over the years, for 30 years, actually. And there's about 129 that are extant at the moment. A lot of them are in archives. I went and visited many of them in the archives, and that was really a great, great experience. But more of them, really, it's nice that so many of them are available on YouTube in pretty good condition, but there's some really brilliant ones out there that aren't available yet. I don't know if they ever will be, but
are there, I mean, we've talked about a few titles. Which ones do you most highly recommend people find and watch?
Well, unfortunately, my sense of humor is probably not like anyone else's. I'm very nearsighted. I've been nearsighted since the age of 6. And so I love The Duel of Mr. Myope. And from Myopic, which is what the name is based on, that this particular character has glasses, Coke bottle glasses, and is nearly blind and is trying to fight a duel. It was hysterical. I never laughed so hard in all my life.
And this is the one with the mirror scene you mentioned earlier. The first
No, this is that was he made like
different duel.
85 different duel movies.
Okay. Well, he was a fencing expert, so I guess an opportunity.
And he was obsessed with death. So yeah, so there's that one. There's a one called Nuit Agité, which means agitated night, where he's dealing with a fly on his nose. You guys have probably seen this one, actually.
I have.
He tries everything. I mean, he tries to set it on fire, and he's laying in bed.
What could
and
go
eventually
wrong?
Gets out a revolver and shoots the thing. It's really funny. Max prend un bain, which is Max takes a bath. That one's really funny, where he has to drag his big, huge metal bathtub out into the hallway near the spigot of the water. He's in this apartment house, and he don't even realize this a bit later that he's on view to everyone. It's pretty funny.
Is that the one where they arrest him and just carry the bathtub to the police station? Yeah,
that's right.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, there's a lot, actually.
Okay. Well, hopefully this will whet the appetite of people who aren't as familiar with him or aren't familiar at all, and they can start exploring this. I want to see if I just dive in a little bit to his friendship with Chaplin, because that's interesting. I know they expressed mutual admiration for each other. And Linder at one point said something to the effect, it's kind of the cliche, the student has become the teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And looking at them, I can't help but wonder if that isn't really true, because it does seem as though you see a definite evolution. I don't know, maybe this was more of an American thing, an American trend, an American desire to, move beyond, take things and build upon them, because most of Linder's films are, at least the ones that I've seen, could have had the Keystone label on them. They were still pretty slapstick for the most part.
Oh, yeah.
And he never seemed to really go beyond farce. I mean, even as well executed a farce as The Three Musketeers. Not having seen the last film, I can't speak to that one, but Au Secours, which was kind of his magical mystery tour, something like that. Whereas Keaton and Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, there's a definite evolution of their films, of the styles. They bringing in more character, more sentimentality, more story structure. So does that sound right? It's just like they kind of out-evolved him?
I think Max really had trouble with plots and stories. He was very much gag driven. I mean, Sidney Chaplin had this problem too a little bit, but I think Max's problem was even greater because he's basically got the same. Of course, Chaplin did a great thing with The Little Tramp and had that in every film, of course. But Max's gentleman character, a lot of the films feel very much the same. Now, he did reissue some of the films again and again. I don't know, they were even the same exact film, only the title was a little different. I think there's 3 films called something about Belle Mère, which is mother-in-law. There's 3 films about his mother-in-law, which he didn't have at the time. But he knew that a mother-in-law was a figure of fun for many people, or could be. So he actually reissued a couple of those films and just called them something different. I think he had trouble coming up with really great plots. So the films that I just mentioned that I love don't have much of a plot. It's more about the stunts, the gags, and I think some of those Chaplin may have seen and some of the other comedians in America too, and used, morphed, whatever. But of course, many people would say that, okay, Max kind of set the tone, but everybody else went with it. And that's
Right.
that's why we do have a decline of Max Linder. I think Max's mental problems had a lot to do with the fact that he wasn't on top anymore. From 1917 on, he was not on top. And I don't think he had money problems or drinking problems or things like that. But when you are the most popular man in France or in Europe for, say, 7, 8, 9 years or so, it's got to be horrifying to wake up one day and realize that that's all gone and not be able to, no matter how hard you try, not to be able to recoup that. He goes to America in 17 and he fails. He comes home, he makes a French film called Le Petit Café. That's all he does at home. I think he fell off a mountain into a crevasse too. I can't remember. But anyway, and he comes back to America, he makes 3 more films. They all did kind of meh. And he comes home and he realizes, okay, now what do I do? Now I got to go to Vienna to make a film because nobody else will hire me. I think he was not able to evolve. So
Yeah.
that was a long answer to that question. I'm sorry.
No, that's quite
as
all
he
right.
should have.
Yeah. Well, and I wondered because of his friendship with Chaplin if there had ever been talk of a collaboration, but I kind of wonder if because Chaplin was evolving and Linder really wasn't, if Chaplin saw that it would not be an effective collaboration. I mean, I think of Linder's performances and well, what would he do in a Chaplin film?
Right.
I mean, he'd be a Leo White, he'd be an Albert Austin.
That's
He
right.
wouldn't really be able to take a major part, I don't think.
No, and Chaplin didn't want to share the limelight with anyone, to
Then
be
there's
honest.
that.
And I mean, there's Jackie Coogan, but that was an accident.
Right.
Yeah, he didn't play well with others. Yeah.
No.
I can't help but wonder if he had held on, survived to the sound era, do you think that the talkies might have given him? I mean, there may not be enough information to even speculate on this really, but I can't help but wonder if that might have given him an avenue to broaden his scope and maybe the type of films then that started being made with comedic dialogue, if that could have revitalized him.
Yeah, it was a stage actor, so I'm certain he had a good voice. It sure would have been interesting to see. I think he was so defeated, though, by that point. I don't know if you can raise yourself up above that. Of course, he didn't live long enough to see the talkies, and he probably had no premonitions that they were coming because it was, he died in 25. So,
and of course, they took longer to establish themselves in Europe than they did in the U.S.
I was just trying to think who was doing talkies in 29 and 30 in France, for instance.
Yeah,
I don't know. Gantz, I guess, or he was still doing silence. I don't know.
Rene Claire, maybe.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility for him, but I think it would have been a long shot too, in some sense.
Yeah, it would have presented a big obstacle getting the American audience at that point because of the technology not really being there and him not having effectively learned English during his time in the States. Well, we've kind of talked around it a bit, but I guess for those who aren't familiar, we kind of do need to talk about his death, as unpleasant as it is. And that in reading your book was even more unpleasant than I had realized. Apparently, I had read accounts of it in other books that didn't go into as much detail. And so do you want to go ahead and cover that?
Yeah. In 1923 and several years before that, Max had decided upon a young girl named Ninette Peters. She was the daughter of a courtesan, and that's just exactly what you think it means. And her mother was the daughter of a courtesan. So born out of wedlock, led a life as a kept woman, basically. Ninette was not a courtesan, and I'm not so sure what her goals were for her life, but certainly not being married to someone like Max, probably. He was 20 plus years older than her, but he was obsessed with her. And I think this feeds into the mental things that were starting to go on. And he whatever you've seen about domestic violence, you can think about that and add 100% probably to it, considering what I read from the transcripts of after the fact, sort of a trial that were in the paper. He was really treating her horribly. And even after the baby arrived, there was a little bit of a break there, but not much of one. So he tried to kill them both in Vienna when they were making King of the Circus by overdosing on Veronal. And we don't know what Veronal is anymore, but it's a drug that makes you go to sleep, basically. So it'd be like taking an overdose of sleeping pills, I think. And Nanette very wisely took less and just basically waited for Max to drop off, pretty much. And the maid found them about 2:00 in the morning and got them to the hospital to get their stomachs pumped. So that one didn't work. He completed the film and then tried again Halloween night. I don't know if he realized it was Halloween or not. I doubt it, but had the whole thing planned. And I think she had told her mother knew actually that things were bad, but she didn't get her out of there. Nanette tried to divorce him and all this sort of thing, but that didn't work either. And so she basically acquiesced at the end to being killed by him on the night of the 31st of October, 1925. So it was a murder-suicide. Had he lived, he did live longer than her. So unfortunately, her mother did not get to take the child. His parents did. That's a whole nother horror story. But had he lived, he would have been tried for murder. He would have had to have been. So it's a tragic. And when you see something about it in the Brownlow documentary, for instance, it's called a double suicide. It was not. It was not a double suicide. It was a murder-suicide. So sad.
Yeah, definitely. Borderline Shakespearean.
Yes.
We should probably mention that despite the tragic ending here, as it turns out, Linder's daughter, Maud, apparently experienced a turnaround, although her early discovery of her father and things that he had done, I guess, and again, this is from what I read in your book, she initially was very angry about that, but then went through a healing process of some sort where she became an advocate for preserving the history of her father. And she was responsible for a documentary called The Man in the Silk Hat that I saw back in the 90s. It was available on video. So
that's on YouTube also. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I encourage people, if we've piqued your interest in it, please get Lisa's book, because I can't imagine there being a better source for information on the life of Max Linder, who, with all his faults and problems and issues, is still a very significant character in the development of film comedy,
Absolutely.
To be more specific. It's available from Bear Manor Books, one of many good film books that they offer. Now, as far as what you're working on now, you mentioned a Keaton book, and of course, that immediately gets my interest. Of course, there have been a number of Keaton books, even in just recent years, several.
I know. Really good ones, too.
How is yours going to be distinctive?
Mine is going to be distinctive. It's going to focus on the really early part. Actually, I'm giving a lot of family information all the way back to Keaton ancestors coming to America. That's the first chapter. And then we go into the vaudeville things, which was started by Myra's dad, Frank Cutler. So there's a lot about Frank that you've never heard before. And then we start with the vaudeville and go through every year in minute detail. This is what I'm good at, minute detail. And we get to 1917, the meeting with Roscoe and the Komiki films, and that's where I stop.
Okay.
So I stop with the end of the Komikis. And I've tried very, very hard not to simply mimic the Curtis book or the Dana Stevens book or whatever, or even the Rudy Blesh book or anything. So I'm using a lot of obscure sources because there's so much online now and so much that's available. So hopefully I've got some stuff in there that people would be interested in reading. We'll see.
Okay. And about when is that going to be coming out? Do you have a publication
My
date?
deadline is December 1st.
Okay.
So I think probably mid next year.
Okay. All right. Something to look forward to. All right. Well, now we come to the question that I ask all my guests, and that is, what is your most memorable movie-going experience?
Well, I think it was not really that long ago when I saw Gantz's Napoleon in its complete form. I think it was 7 hours at the time, and it was a dress rehearsal. So there was only a few people in the audience. You know, we got to enjoy the music and we got to enjoy the film. We broke for dinner in the middle, came back, saw the rest of it, and it's complete with the triptychs at the end and everything. Or actually, they're in the middle, some of them.
Was that up in Oakland?
No, it was actually in Paris.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It was several years before it became available to everybody. So it was back probably 2014, 15, something like that. I don't know. But that's one of the ones I count as my best.
All right. Well, Napoleon is running away with it in the voting as far as the memorable movie-going experience among my guests. Yes, I think you're at least the third who has referenced that.
Do you know Ridley Scott refused to see it?
Really?
Yeah, Ridley Scott said he couldn't get through it. So that's the guy that's doing the new Napoleon with Joaquin, of course.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, Lisa, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us and talk about Max Linder. Like I say, I think this fills a gap in a lot of people's knowledge of cinema history and silent comedy in particular. So I hope that people will pick up your book, fill in that gap, and enjoy the films. Thank you once again for joining us on Movie Nights and Matinees.
Well, thank you very much.
As we mentioned during the discussion, many of Max Linder's surviving films are available on YouTube. In addition, there are some DVD and Blu-ray compilations that have noteworthy extras included, which you can find on the screening room page of the Movie Nights and Matinees website. And if you like, you can order them through Amazon from the links there. Look for Lisa on the featured guests page, and clicking on her photo there will take you to her website, where you can learn more about her and her writing. If you haven't already done so, please click on the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen and submit a rating and review where possible. Be sure to share the podcast with your friends who have an interest in classic cinema, and don't forget to swing by the Movie Nights and Matinees Facebook page where you can interact with other listeners and occasionally find some supplementary photos and such tied to the episodes. Come back in a couple of weeks for episode 22, which will feature a guest who's produced some interesting documentaries on areas of film history that have tended to be overlooked. In the meantime, happy Thanksgiving, or as some like to call it, Turkey Day. If you do call it Turkey Day, maybe throw on a bad movie or two.